closer to your mic, Dave. You have to,
Okay.
there you go.
All right. So sorry, folks, for the delay. We are none of us are tech experts in this, so we do apologize for the delay. My name is David Trahan. I'm the executive director of the Sportsman's Alliance of Maine. Thank you for being patient. I think that once you hear what exciting things are going on with white-tailed deer, particularly deer yards, you'll be glad you tuned in.
I think it's going to his iPad.
All right. Well, I'm going to start by first introducing who's on this live Facebook feed, and I'm going to start with Jerry on my left, Jerry Levine, and you'll introduce yourself, and then I'll get down through the other folks.
Hi, folks. Jerry Levine. I have retired from fisheries and wildlife as 30 years after being a deer biologist for 30 years. And since that time, I've been associated with the Sportsman's Alliance, doing various projects to try to improve deer survival in various ways by improving habitat or engaging in predation management and other regulatory things as well. At SAM, we've partnered a lot with the department, and we consider the department a valuable asset for deer management if they have the regulatory tools they need to get the job done. And part of what we're doing tonight is going to involve additional authority for the department to manage deer wintering areas.
To my right is Bob Humphrey. Bob, would you go ahead and introduce yourself and who you represent?
Yeah, I'm the founder, owner, admin of the Maine Deer Hunters Facebook page. I'm a deer hunter, a Maine guide, an outdoor writer, and a wildlife biologist. So I can interpret, I can read and speak fluent science. So when these guys try to pull the wool over your eyes, I can interpret and translate that to something that you can understand. And I'm here basically as kind of the go-between. I'm the voice of 44,000 Maine deer hunters between you folks and the department.
Awesome. So we have a couple of folks on Zoom, actually three. I'm going to let, there's two Nates on here, and I'll let you start, Nate Webb, introduce yourself and the other two gentlemen that are with you, and then we'll get started.
Sure. Thanks for having us, David. My name is Nate Webb. I'm the Wildlife Division Director for IF&W, based out of our headquarters in Augusta.
All right. We have
Hi, folks. This is Ryan Robichaud. I'm the Wildlife Management Section Supervisor for the agency. Relative to the discussion tonight, I work with the Regional Work Program, who interacts with private landowners and management of deer wintering areas. I also oversee our state-owned wildlife management areas and the activities we undertake to manage for habitat on those locations as well.
Awesome.
And Nathan Bieber, I'm the IFW deer biologist for the last about 3.5 years now. I appreciate the invitation. I'm very interested to learn more about the bill and to see where all this goes. Thanks.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for folks that are tuned into this live Facebook event. Please be patient with us as we work through this. I'm going to start by just telling where this bill came from. For those who don't know me, I'm a former state legislator. I was a senator for 2 terms and a representative for 4. I served all of those years on the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife Committee. This is my now 3rd attempt to try and do something to change the policy around deer wintering areas to help to conserve and really enhance, particularly northern, eastern, and western Maine deer yard protection. So earlier this year, Representative Johansson from Monticello approached SAM, Sportsman's Alliance of Maine, and said, can you do something to help us up in our community? We're struggling to figure out how to do something to protect deer yards. Can you help me? So I introduced what's called a concept draft to buy some time to meet with knowledgeable people to figure out, first of all, what the issues are and maybe how to resolve them. Met several times with the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, introduced the concept draft, and then went to work Nate Webb, particularly from the department, was very, very helpful in sort of guiding me along, giving me information. That's why they're on this call. I think that they're terrific assets for the state of Maine on protecting deer wintering areas. I went to Jerry Levine, who I think is one of the most respected deer biologists in the state, knowledgeable, has the experience. He weighed in heavily on this legislation. I let Bob Humphrey know, Will Lund from the Maine Sportsman, and V. Paul Reynolds from the Northwood Sporting Journal, that and this is the way I framed it. I said, let's go big or go home, because something big needs to happen, a change in policy and a real commitment to bring deer back in certain parts of the state. So I said, let's not be shy about putting something into this bill that we believe needs to happen to make a difference. And so with that, LD 404 is the number of the legislation. The bill is being heard next Wednesday at 10 o'clock in the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife Committee. People can testify by Zoom by going on to the Maine legislative website. As I'm going down through this bill, I may ask some of the panelists to elaborate on the importance of some of these provisions. I'll read you the provisions and then ask if somebody wants to weigh in on why they're important. If not, I will. So I'm going to start right at the top with the summary of this bill. And there is a link on our SAM website SAM Facebook page to the actual legislation, so you can go see it for yourself. All right, section 1 of this bill, and I remind the listeners, you can on either Facebook page, Bob's in particular, you can ask questions, and Bob will look at those questions and try to have some of your concerns addressed and your questions asked. So at this point, I'll start with section 1. Section 1 establishes a preferential consideration of deer wintering areas identified by the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife under the Land for Maine's Future program, and specifies that lands acquired for this purpose must be owned and managed by the department. This is a dramatic policy change, and Jerry, I think you can probably speak to this real quickly, but having the department actually own deer yards is something fairly new. They do have wildlife management areas that they manage, but an actual deer yard owned by the department is a new and dramatic policy. You want to speak to that just briefly?
Sure. Actually, perhaps Ryan or Nate Webb could give us a brief history and understanding of deer yard protection through the years. I can take a stab at it, and they can elaborate on it as needed. Folks who are a bit older really remember when the northern half of the state was the deer capital, and deer yards were abundant, and there were at least 1 million acres of deer wintering habitat in the 50s and 60s that sheltered deer. And it was before there were coyotes, so predation was not a major factor. There were over 2,000 deer yards in the northern half of the state based on surveys done by the biologists in the 50s and 60s. And over time, we've lost a lot of these, and we've lost the quality of them. By the early 70s, the department began to look for ways to conserve and manage deer wintering habitat. And they initially went the route of regulation under what was then called the Maine Land Use Regulation Commission. And they got a lot of deer wintering habitat protected in the 1970s, but it was just a start and a fraction of what the total had been. Another focus the department had gotten into was to develop cooperative agreements with landowners. As you folks all know, just about all land in Maine is privately owned, and so managing deer on that property requires the cooperation of the people who own it and the corporations who own it. And those two approaches, regulatory under LERC as protection zones and cooperative agreements, were the two major focuses to try to restore quality to the habitat for wintering deer, and also to conserve them for future use. we think a third element is important, and that's where this legislation comes in. We think it's important also for when opportunities arrive for the department to actually own and manage those wintering areas themselves, and so that they can intensively manage the habitat as well as manage the predation that occurs in wintering areas. At this point, perhaps we could have one of the department people or more elaborate on some of these things, including the predation management program the department has going on right now. Nate Webb, perhaps?
I think actually probably Ryan could discuss those details better than I. That's a great summary though, Jerry. I think you hit all the high points, but Ryan manages our predation management program in collaboration with the regional staff, and also kind of has his fingers in deer wintering area management on private land as much as anybody in the agency. So I'd turn over to Ryan to give a little more detail.
Yeah, just to elaborate on your points, Jerry, I do know the department back even in the 50s was starting to go down the road of cooperative agreements with private landowners, the large, mill ownerships at the time. And then when the Land Use Protection Commission was established in 1973, they authorized the ability to formally protect areas that pass the survey thresholds for deer use and wintering conditions and the habitat conditions for deer wintering areas. And, now that things have transitioned back to it never went away, but that cooperative management agreement approach is still employed in conjunction with PFW, Protection Fish and Wildlife Areas, in what is now the Land Use Planning Commission. So that was a good recap of kind of the history of deer yard management in Maine, at least from the 50s forward. I would say one other change on the landscape was the spruce budworm outbreak from the mid 70s to the mid to late 80s, which in my opinion drastically changed the forest conditions on the landscape. I think relative to wildlife management areas, we touched on that briefly. We do own and manage about 8,000 acres of deer winter shelter in the state. We had never necessarily had the opportunity or pursued acquisition of deer yards, mainly as a function of the department's land acquisition goals and efforts, but we do engage with landowners cooperatively and through LUPC in management of winter shelter for deer on the landscape. I don't know if that hit on kind of all the points I was thinking of, but a little bit of additional background there.
So I want to speak just a moment for those folks that are out there. Inland Fisheries and Wildlife currently owns about 100,000 acres of land. A lot of those wildlife management areas are managed for wading bird habitat and other wildlife protection and management, really, to keep the populations healthy. One of the things in this bill that I think is incredibly important is not only does it prioritize land for Maine future bond purchases for deer wintering areas, but this legislation creates a deer yard wildlife management area, and it would be managed specifically and at highest priority for deer. So not only are you prioritizing the purchase of deer yards through the Land for Maine's Future program, but you're also creating a wildlife management area specifically designed for managing for deer in the winter. That is very, very, I think, bold. I think it's exciting that we're going in this direction. And I just wanted to note it because it is a dramatic change from the past where we haven't been successful in protecting and managing for deer yards. And now it's possible that the department could own them. I'm going to move to section 2 of the bill. It allows Land for Maine's Future funds to be used for the development of a management plan for deer wintering areas on lands acquired for the purpose. And what it does is it allows up to 5% of the money designated for that project to be used for a management plan. what good is a deer yard if you're not planning on managing it for that purpose? This is key, I think, to the department having the tools, the direction that they need when they do acquire through Land for Maine's Future a parcel of land, that they have a plan for that property. And that's section 2 of this legislation. Anyone want to add to that?
David, I completely glossed over to touch on the predation management program. So if we
Sure.
have some time, I'd like to go back and just talk briefly about that. So
Sure. Go
the
ahead.
department is allocated funding, through the general fund for predation management within and around deer wintering areas. We also receive another $1 from each deer that's registered that goes into a predation management fund. And we allocate those funds based on priorities determined by the regional wildlife biologist and their interactions with sportsmen on the landscape, warden service, and their knowledge of high priority deer wintering areas to focus those efforts, both prior to and throughout the yarding period in the winter in Maine.
We lost him. Can't hear you. We can't hear.
Can you hear me now, Dave?
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay, I don't know quite what people heard of that, but we do receive funding for predation management control.
Yep.
That we prioritize deer wintering areas to focus those efforts through private contractual agreements with effective hunting and trapping components of that program.
Sure. We lost him again.
I think, another, so I could weigh in, David,
Yep.
a
Sure.
key point that you mentioned, regarding our wildlife management areas, they really are pretty unique in the state in terms of the land ownership across the state, and that, we manage those with wildlife as the highest priority. And like you mentioned, those management goals do vary depending on the location and the habitats that are contained within the management area in terms of the species that we're prioritizing for. But in every case, wildlife is the priority. We have quite a bit of flexibility in terms of our management options. We have, relatively few constraints in terms of funding and some of those economic considerations that, private landowners would have to always weigh. So, management areas that we own are really kind of the cat's meow in terms of habitat management for wildlife, from my perspective.
So, with that, I want to move on to section 3. We'll try to get down through this, and then at the end we can start to ask some questions if you have some folks asking questions, Bob. The next section of the bill directs the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife to identify areas that are important to the conservation of deer, which I can't imagine us being successful without the most knowledgeable people in the state, the biologists who are on the ground, identifying what those priorities are. And that's why this section of the bill is in there. Instead of, in the past, the LMF projects that would come forward would be put forward by conservation groups, local communities, where they might want a hiking trail or a certain project, a boat launch or something that they'd want to purchase locally. When you have projects coming forward and the project developers are saying it's a deer yard, chances are that it's probably not. But when a department person, a biologist comes forward who's working on the ground and says, this is a deer yard, it's a priority, it elevates the credibility of that project to a much higher level. That's why that language is in there. This identifying deer yards as a priority in an LMF bond, that language came from the last bond, language that Jerry Levine, sitting next to me, wrote and put into the last bond. Because of that language, it was a $5 million bond, about 2,000 acres of deer yard up in the Forks region or deer wintering area was purchased, and I believe 10,000 acres altogether of deer wintering areas were identified in that bond. Unfortunately, some of those lands were not high quality deer wintering areas in the view of the department. This language narrowly focuses the direction for the department to go out and seek their priorities, not the priorities of other folks on the ground whose priorities may be a hiking trail or something different. So that's incredibly important language. It's in there. The second component of this, department to acquire these lands, which must be designated as wildlife management areas. I spoke to that earlier. That also allows the department to seek federal matching funds through Pittman Robertson. It allows them more financial resources when they do purchase these lands under a wildlife management area. They're more eligible for federal funding. It directs the department to ensure that appropriate deed restrictions are placed on the land acquired, and to develop appropriate purchase and sale agreements to ensure that deer habitat on land to be acquired is preserved as deer habitat prior to the purchase. That is to ensure that some of these projects that may take a year, 2 or 3 to acquire, that those deer yards are still there when the department does finally purchase them. And then beginning on January the 15th, 2023, and annually thereafter, the department is required to report to the Joint Standing Committee of the legislature having jurisdiction over inland fisheries and wildlife and on the acquisition and management of deer wintering areas. That's an accountability component that allows the committee elected by the people to have oversight of this program. So that's section 3 of this bill, and there's 3 more sections. Would anyone here like to add to this? The department possibly want to add to what I just said?
Nothing from my end, Dave. I think you covered that pretty well.
Okay. So the next section, right now, the fund that Nate Webb was speaking of earlier, there was a fund established over 10 years ago, and I helped write it. It was a fund, the Predation Fund. It's a special dedicated account at Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. We amend the language of that protected account to direct the department or give the department the authority to acquire deer habitat with the money from that fund. And at the end, I'm going to speak to the funding component of this because I think that's one of the most exciting pieces of this legislation. It also authorizes, this section 5, authorizes the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife to prohibit or limit the feeding of deer, bear, moose, or turkey as part of the plan to promote the use of deer wintering areas by deer. Now, some of you might say, oh, wait a minute, it can be a very controversial issue, feeding deer. But this language is very important. And I think Nate Webb really did a terrific explanation for me the other day on why this is so important. Would you like to speak to this, Nate? And I'll also speak to it afterwards.
Sure. I would just take the opportunity too, David, to clarify for the viewers that because this legislation is pending and there hasn't yet been a public hearing, we can't, as department employees, comment specifically on the content of the bill or share our position, but certainly we can, as we've been doing, talk generally about deer wintering area management. Feeding, I think, for those folks that are listening in that are familiar with the situation with deer in northern Maine, it's a pretty pervasive activity on the landscape, and we actually have some research underway that Nathan Bieber could speak more about, I'm sure, looking at the impact of feeding deer in northern Maine on their survival and movements and behavior. But I think one thing that does seem clear to us is that any plan to try to return deer to traditional wintering habitat, has to include a conversation about feeding that might be occurring near to or adjacent to that habitat. So in other words, if there's a significant amount of feeding going on just up the road adjacent to or nearby to a deer wintering area, it's probably going to be pretty challenging to get deer to use that habitat in the winter because there's that highly attractive food source in a place that's easy for them to access. So, whenever we're talking about deer management or deer wintering area management in northern Maine, feeding has to be part of that conversation.
Yeah, I'll just comment a little bit about that. Deer wintering areas and deer feeding areas can be in close proximity, or they can be as much as several miles away. Over time, deer change their habits based on where the food's available and that type of thing. To successfully restore deer to wintering habitat, as Nate mentioned, we may find it necessary to transmit or change the feeding locations so that we can get deer to utilize natural habitat again. I think in the long run, it's important to get deer back into natural habitat and away from feeding areas because of all kinds of concerns that include disease transmission, like chronic wasting disease possibilities, but also because long-term feeding areas produce overutilization of the habitat where they're being fed in. In the long run, feeding is not sustainable in a given location for deer. It's a good measure to improve survival in the short term, but I think the department is right on the mark by wanting to manage deer in natural habitat in preference to places where they're fed at high concentrations. So that's the reason for this part of the bill, to give them the tools to transition deer back to natural habitat.
I do want to add to that what I think is an essential component of this, and that is a lot of people feed deer because they want to see them in their backyard. And oftentimes when feeding in the wrong place, you can draw deer, significant amounts of deer across major highways. Animals get hit. And if your goal is to improve the survival of white-tailed deer, and inadvertently you're killing those on the highway, you've already begun by defeating your purpose. So being smart about this, and this is where I think the listeners, I think, could get some comfort. In my discussions with the department, that would not be a conflict. In other words, with the community, from what I've had for discussions, it would be a cooperative discussion that would occur with the community. If the state comes in and buys a 5,000 acre parcel of land to manage as a deer yard, I expect that the community would want to coordinate with the department to ensure a good habitat, year-round habitat program. Because remember, these are wildlife management areas managed solely for deer as the highest priority. Of course, other things will benefit, but in that plan would be major components like feeding patterns that the department could work with the community to change to enhance the survival of deer. So this could be something that may seem controversial in the beginning, but if a community is working together to restore deer and improve the deer population regionally, I think that they would readily accept some of these more controversial components if they know in the end that it's going to help their deer herd. So in my discussions with the department, I was really impressed with the approach that they were planning to take in this area. And remember, this is for areas that are being purchased and managed for deer by the department. It's not a statewide policy at this point, but I suspect if this is successful, other parts of the state would want to utilize a similar tool. So with that, I want to move on to the last couple of components of this bill, and then we can start getting into questions. The next section of this bill directs the department to develop and establish a position in the 2022 and 23 biennial budget to coordinate the acquisition and management of deer wintering areas using the Deer Management Fund and federal funds as a revenue source. It is critically important that the department have a position whose sole responsibility is to coordinate these types of purchases. It takes a pretty savvy person to go to landowners and coordinate a project of this size. So this person's position is going to be incredibly important, but just the fact that we have to have one to oversee this important work. And so this was language that I think everyone agreed it needed to be in this bill. Some people out there are now wondering, how are we going to pay for this? And I want to speak to that because I think it is the most important piece of the program going forward. There are several ways in which this new program or this new effort can be funded. Currently, there's, I think, 2 Land for Maine's Future bonds before the Maine legislature. One is sponsored by, I don't even remember now, but the second, there's one, I think it's somewhere around $70 million. The second bond is a Sportsman's Alliance of Maine bond. That is a $35 million bond over, I believe, 3 years, sponsored by Representative Corey, and had a public hearing just a few days ago. That bill has the deer language that I just described to you. That that bill, I believe, has a really good chance of passing. The way that an LMF bond goes before the people is it has to pass the legislature with a 2/3 vote. Then it goes out to the people to be ratified in a referendum. If that bill gets out of the legislature and this language is adopted, which I believe it has a 90% chance that it will, there'll be a $30 million bond over the next 3 years that would be one component of the deer wintering area purchases. The second is the fund that was described earlier, the protected fund that has now been amended to acquire deer wintering areas. There is some money now in that account. It's less than $500,000, but that money is, I believe, seed money that would then be used to begin the coordination of some of these purchases. When this bill is done, there's a second component if it gets through the legislature. There is a committee that's meeting over the summer, and I'm on it. Actually, Jerry doesn't know it, but he's going to be our representative on it, to restructure the doe or the antlerless permit system with an eye toward generating revenue through that system to help fund this effort. For example, what might happen would be fee for the application for an antlerless permit, or at the time of actually getting a permit, a fee is say $5. With that money all put into this dedicated account to be used for the purposes of purchasing deer wintering areas. For the listeners that are out there on the Maine Deer Facebook page, I want you to think about this for a minute. As a sportsman or a woman who's buying a hunting license, you're going to become a landowner. This land is going to be purchased for the purposes of protecting deer habitat, deer yards. So in a sense, as a hunter, as a person who purchases a license, you're going to help restore the deer, and you're going to be a landowner. And in a sense, you're going to be a steward of the white-tailed deer's future. I think that's exciting. I know that none of us want to pay additional fees. That's never popular. But if you know every dollar of that's going to go to something as important as restoring deer yards or purchasing deer yards and restoring the deer population, then I think that's pretty exciting. Another option on the table would be a straight out fee increase. Again, we're not going to say which one's going to happen because a task force is getting together over the summer and fall to determine what that's going to look like. But that's a second potential revenue source. I like that one myself, and I would gladly pay the additional fee. The next source of revenue are what are called mitigation dollars. When there are projects like energy projects, solar, wind, whatever the projects may be, even development of or any kind of development, the state negotiates what are called mitigation program. For instance, if a big project is going to fill in 50 acres of wetland, the company is told to go out and replace that 50 acres of wetland by purchasing the equivalent land and protecting it. Under those mitigation, I guess not development, but projects, sometimes millions of dollars is set aside for the purposes of purchasing habitat. We're going to push policy toward requiring some of those mitigation dollars to go to buy deer yards. That's the third source of revenue. And then the fourth is federal matching funds. Because these dollars are coming in and these projects are being purchased by the department, they are eligible for federal matching funds. Sometimes those funds can be as much as 2 to 1, depends on the way that the program is structured. So you have 4 sources of potential revenue coming into the state of Maine to help pay for this. So with that, I'm going to stop there and ask Jerry or Bob if you have any questions, or Nate and Ryan if you want to add anything more to that, what I just said.
Nothing from my end, Dave. I think you've covered it very well. And I think we're happy to take any questions. I would offer that we have Nathan Bieber with us. He is our state deer biologist. So this is a good opportunity if folks have some other general questions about deer in northern Maine. He's our expert, and I'm sure he'd be happy to try to address some other questions as well that folks might have an interest in.
Okay, great. Do anybody else want to add anything before we move on to questions? Or
Jerry?
Yeah, I think at this point, it'd be good to kind of summarize what we're trying to accomplish here. For years, the department had two strategies for management and conservation of deer wintering habitat. Both of them involved other landowners. And we've been kind of stuck at about 2 or 3% of the landscape in deer yard, when what we really need is closer to 10% of the landscape. So this whole legislation is an attempt to get a third strategy in place in which we could add to the total land base of wintering habitat and have it managed properly in the long run by an agency that knows how to do it and is willing to spend the money for the extra cost of more frequent timber harvesting that's needed in deer yards, creation of summer and winter browse, for example, as well as getting involved in the predation management aspect of this that's not taking place in other locations now. So this is really a game changer for what we've been looking at for the last 40 years, really, in terms of deer yard management. So we're trying to get off the dime on this and improving what's going on out in the woodlands.
so with that, anyone at the department want to add a comment before we move on to possibly some questions?
We're ready for some questions if folks have them.
Okay, all right. So Bob, we're going to start with you because I see you've been scratching down some questions there while we were
Well,
talking.
yeah, I'm actually taking these off the feed. I have one, but I'm going to save it the best
Okay.
for last.
Okay.
This is the first one is a two-part question from somebody out there. And I think you've fairly well answered the first part, which is how will we pay for this? But I'm going to give you an opportunity maybe to give us the Reader's Digest version. But
Mhm.
before I do, the second part is what will these purchases look like? Will it be outright fair market value purchase? Will it be easements? Will it be donations, or will it be all of the above?
Well, I think that's a great question. I would envision that it would be all of the above. Obviously, the state will take a donation. If somebody comes forward and says, I have a deer wintering area, and the department says, yeah, we agree, and it is of importance to us, obviously they would take a donation of land. There's nothing in this legislation that forces anyone to sell land to the state of Maine. It doesn't impose new regulations on landowners who have possibly deer wintering areas. So it really shouldn't frighten anybody. This is a program that purchases these areas from willing sellers and at fair market value. Under the Land for Maine's Future program, they have a very extensive assessment procedure that's in place. They pay fair market value. So anytime that a project goes through that Land for Maine's Future board, you can be guaranteed that it's going to have all the scrutiny. You're going to see fair market value. There'll be a management plan in place. The department itself will have to develop an internal mini Land for Maine's Future program. Basically, that's what we're doing here. The department, this is important. Having been a legislator and a lobbyist now for 10 years, see, I must be moving on close to 25 years I've been involved in this process. Land for Maine's Future bonds have become very controversial and difficult to pass. We can't have a program that spits and sputters, that is good for 2 years and then goes dormant for 5. Because what you do is you establish a priority or lack of priority being deer wintering areas. So for me, you have to be consistent. Every year you have to be investing. You have to be out there seeking these deer wintering areas. So that's why the other component contained within the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife statutes that creates a dedicated account with an annual stream of money is crucial. For those years when LMF is not available, the department can continue its important work, both manage these deer wintering areas and still seek them out. A fund like the one we're talking about, with annual revenue of $500,000, if they go out and seek a project, that matching money, or I should say that $500,000 is matched by federal money. It's also matched by private money. So what you can do is you can take a $500,000 revenue stream and possibly turn it into $1.5 million in 1 year, maybe more, depending on how important the project is to various groups. So what we're talking about is an ongoing, well-funded program that is not at the whims of an LMF bond. And I think that's crucial to the future of the program.
Yeah, I think you make some very important points there. When we initially posted this a little while back, there was a lot of comment about, well, here we go again. It's the same old thing, and it's a taking, and we're taking land or taking the ability to use land from private landowners, and that's exactly not what's happening. This is going to be purchased outright, and it's going to be state land. It's going to be public land, which leads to our next question, which I suspect we know the answer to, but somebody asks, will hunting be allowed on these protected deer wintering areas?
Does anyone from the department want to take this? Because
I think
I'd like
Ryan could speak to our policy on hunting, trapping, and fishing, but that's one of the top priorities for lands that we own, is to provide those opportunities.
did you want to speak to that, Ryan?
Well, I would just add that, yeah, typically we do not regulate or restrict hunting within deer wintering areas, whether that's up north or central or southern Maine. I think if it did get to the point where we had concerns, for management of the deer within and adjacent to the deer yard, we could put into effect some sort of regulations or restrictions, but typically we don't do that. Hunting season typically doesn't coincide with yarding periods, regardless.
Gotcha. Go ahead.
Okay, well, one of your comments was another perfect segue to the next question, which is, what parts of the state are these deer wintering areas going to be?
Does anyone in the department want to take that, or?
So I wonder, maybe we could have Nathan just talk a little bit about kind of the portions of the state where, deer are struggling a little bit more, and where we're seeing more significant impacts from severe winters. We actually just had our annual internal any deer permit meeting yesterday, so he's got some information at his fingertips, I'm guessing, that he could use to address that question.
Yeah, typically our northern Maine deer are the deer that we'd be looking to protect with these acquisitions, though in a more severe winter in southern and central Maine, deer will still spend some time in deer wintering cover, but only during the most restrictive conditions. So for the most part in central and southern Maine, a lot of coastal Maine, this sort of cover, while occasionally useful, is not as vital to deer survival as it would be in, say, our northern 6 districts and in the western mountains. So I think if we were looking to acquire more deer wintering habitat, to really key on the important areas, it would be primarily those northern 6 districts and the western mountain areas that would be the most important to us.
All right. Do you have any other questions?
I do. This is my own, and I've been saving it up. This is an outstanding program that we're proposing here, but I think there's a way that possibly we could supplement this even more. And I don't have my numbers with me, but the percentages I don't think have changed much since the last time I looked at this. The Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife manages something in the neighborhood of 100,000 acres. Right now, less than 3% of that is managed as deer wintering area. The Bureau of Parks and Lands owns probably 6 times that, and it's maybe 80+% is not managed as a deer wintering area. So we have all this state land. It's already public land. State already owns it. It's hard for me to fathom that 20, 50, 80 years down the road, if this isn't managed, that this couldn't be managed for deer wintering habitat.
It's a very interesting question and perspective. I might wait my turn here. Does anyone from the department want to speak to that?
Yeah, I guess I have a question back to you, Bob. So is your question, is there potential for more of the existing land and state ownership to be managed with deer as the priority? Is that what you're getting at?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's actually, there's significant acreage of the Bureau of Public Lands ownership, the public reserve land that is managed as deer wintering area, and we work very closely with them on managing those properties. We actually have a dedicated staff biologist that we assign to the Bureau of Parks and Lands, and a big part of her job and her responsibility is to work closely with the foresters on management of those deer wintering areas, as well as working with them on a whole host of other habitat management activities for wildlife. So I would say in general, the deer wintering areas that the Bureau of Parks and Lands owns, they are managing for deer as one of the top priorities. With our agency, the vast majority of our management areas, and again, Ryan could speak to this in more detail, are actually in southern and central Maine, where there just aren't as many deer wintering areas, and those that do exist aren't as important to deer survival as Nathan alluded to. We just don't own a lot of land in the northern part of the state. So that's the primary reason that we're not managing a lot of our land base with winter shelter for deer as a priority. That being said, of the management areas we do own, certainly deer habitat is a big part of the management goals for those properties, but it's primarily in central and southern Maine where the deer are already doing pretty well.
I do want to speak to that just for a moment. The benefit of being 58 years old is that you've seen a lot of change in the state. When I was a kid, the whitetail deer ruled in northern Maine, and a lot has changed over those almost 6 decades. Government, and I bring that up because government has a way of slowly reacting to changes on the landscape. Now, when the Land for Maine's Future program was created, it was just after the spruce budworm outbreak. There was a huge land base that was changing ownership, and the state was trying to react to that changing landscape to conserve some of those lands into public ownership so that they could guarantee access for all sorts of traditional recreational access. Well, over the years, the white-tailed deer's population has changed dramatically. And I don't think state policymakers could have foreseen how dramatically that changed. The population of deer kept moving south. And I think that the patterns of land ownership for the state just did not keep up with the priority of protecting some of those deer wintering areas. So now we're in I believe the point in time where there's going to be a change in policy to address what has happened on the landscape with the white-tailed deer. It is an incredibly important animal for rural Maine. It was at one time an economic boom for northern, eastern, and western Maine. And Jerry did a terrific explanation to me on what that means for some communities. When communities lost the deer population, they lost a major component of their economy as well. There is not just the element of being able to hunt trophy white-tailed deer in northern Maine. There's also the cultural and traditional aspects and the economic impact that these white-tailed deer have on these communities. And it's also about restoring that component of the white-tailed deer, is what it does for our communities. So we are in the process of a change in direction that I think has been coming for a long time. And it is in reaction to what's happening on the ground. And I say now it's better to do this now, even though we've lost a lot of those deer wintering areas, than it is to continue down this same course, because obviously we know we're not doing a good enough job. So with that, I would like, Jerry, you did a terrific job explaining what it means if we restore deer to these areas of the state of Maine. If you could speak to that briefly.
Well, the year 2000 plan update for the department, I was asked to do a projection of what would the deer harvest be like if we could bring the population back to just 10 deer per square mile in northern Maine, the northern half of the state. And in considering that and considering the harvest to stabilize the population, we'd be looking at 45,000 deer harvested, a good proportion of which is returned back to the northern half of the state, while the southern half still remains strong in population. And that would require an additional increase in hunters moving back to northern Maine again, like they had traditionally for decades and decades prior to the year 2000. You have to recognize this isn't going to be accomplished everywhere right away, but incrementally, the more wintering habitat we can restore to productivity, then the better the deer hunting is going to be in the northern half of the state. One thing I'd like to point out about, we're talking about deer yards and opportunities to purchase and things like that. Deer wintering habitat is a pretty traditional thing for as far as the deer go. What they seek is still on the landscape. The trouble is the forest has changed due to budworm and harvesting and growth patterns of hardwood versus softwood. They change over time, but 85% of our deer yards always have been and will remain in the riparian zones of our lakes, ponds, rivers, and streams. And those lakes and ponds are all still there. It's just that the forest is different. Now, as the forest changes over time, it's going to grow back to softwood cover. And when it grows back to softwood cover again, it's going to attract deer again. So this whole thing is kind of doing a dance to anticipate where our traditional wintering habitats have been and where our opportunities to manage them in the future are going to be. And this ability to own wintering habitat ties right into the regrowth of the forest and changes in forest management.
So Bob, do you have any more questions?
I do. I have another question here. This is directed primarily to the department. At the last point when there was a concerted effort to try to map and zone deer yards, I was involved in that. I flew, mapped, and rated all the deer yards in Region B. That didn't end very well, and we're back where we were then. Assuming that this bill passes and the money becomes available, what is the department doing now, and what would you do in addition to that to locate and prioritize specific pieces of property for purchase?
Do you want to take that one, Ryan, or I'm happy to? It's up to you.
Sure. No, we annually still survey, deer wintering habitat in the state. That's something we do on an annual basis when we have yarding conditions. As you can imagine, with the variation in weather, some years we do much more than others, but we do aerial survey, we do ground survey, and we have a pretty good idea of what yards are being utilized. I can say that that's not as large a percentage as we would like to see, which is partly why we're here today. But we annually conduct aerial and ground survey of deer wintering areas. And I don't foresee that changing in the near future. That is an obligation tied back to protection fish and wildlife areas in LERC jurisdiction or LUPC jurisdiction as well.
And just to add to that a little bit, I do want to take the opportunity to just thank all the private landowners as well as Bureau of Parks and Lands for the work that they do with regard to deer wintering area management. We have very good working relationships with all the large landowners in the state. And, I think as has been described, this discussion tonight is talking about another tool in the toolbox. And, but there are other tools that we would continue to use. And I think no matter how much deer wintering area habitat ends up in public ownership, there's in Maine, given the nature of the land ownership patterns here, there's probably always going to be quite a bit in private hands as well. And so, we want to make sure that we're recognizing the good work that the private landowners are doing, and we certainly hope to continue that as well, regardless of how this discussion on this bill moves forward.
For the folks that are listening, it's my experience as a former legislator and a lobbyist that, and maybe this is an admission of a failure on my part. I don't believe so, but some may take it that way. When it comes to Land for Maine's future bonds or state taxpayer dollars, there are organizations that are out there aggressively seeking priority purchases for what they believe are their priorities. And they can be everything from protecting endangered species like the lynx to a boat launch or a hiking trail. I think one of the things that maybe the sporting outdoor community has failed to do is have an equal seat at the table when those dollars are being doled out for public purchase. Really using the Land for Maine's Future program to prioritize the purchase of deer yards is new. It's a new concept that Jerry and I worked on, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. But it's time that Sportsman, we are a large group. We are statewide. We have more supporters than our I guess, anti-hunting opposition tells the public that we have. We are a powerful political voice, and we haven't been at the table saying we want the state to prioritize the purchase of deer yards as part of their conservation of special places and resources. Well, those days are over. One reason why I asked Bob to come onto this website is when you have 44,000 followers on a Facebook page, you have the nearly 10,000 people that we influence as SAM at Sportsman's Alliance of Maine, and the 70 fishing game clubs that I can reach that have 30,000 members. Suddenly we have a block of voters and influence that can make a difference in the political process. What part of my reasoning for coming on here is I've heard for years, for 2 decades, we've got to do something more to protect our deer, particularly our deer yards. Well, now's the time. And there is a huge group of folks out there that can make a difference and change the policy of the state. So this bill is going to be heard next Wednesday. I think it's crucial to start down this path, establish a priority, use the members across the state who care, use the members of this Facebook page, as well as Sportsmen as a whole, sportsmen and women, and muscle up to the table, throw your elbows a little bit and say, move over, we're at the table now, and we want to have influence over where some of these resources go. And we want to influence the future of the whitetail deer herd in the entire state of Maine. I'm inviting you to join us in this effort. This is as strong a policy change as I have seen in my lifetime. It's clearly a new direction for the state of Maine. I'm reminded of the bear referendum. When I was part of the polling, I was part of the leadership team that won that referendum. When the credibility of the speakers was tested, the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife had by far the highest approval ratings as credible individuals to manage our wildlife. This legislation reinforces the credibility at that department and the trust that we have as sportsmen that they can help turn this thing around. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Nate, but I remember trust the experts was the language that we used. Well, that's what this is doing. We're putting our resources out there as sportsmen and women, and we're going to trust the people who know how to manage wildlife to help us turn this thing around. And that's why this is so important. I needed to say that because it's a concept that is used all the time. Unions use it. They collectively get together and they use their voices to try to make change. And that's really what I'm asking the sportsmen and women of the state to do. With that, I'm going to ask folks if they want to say anything more. Do you have any more questions that you think you'd like to ask?
I do, and it's a brief one, but before I do, I just want to say thank you very much, David, on behalf of the 44,000 plus members of Maine Deer Hunters for giving us the privilege of being able to introduce this piece of legislation on our page, and to thank the folks from the department for your time and indulgence, and Jerry for coming down here to fill us all in. When the time comes and we need some support from our membership, we will let you folks know what we need and where we need it, who to contact within the legislature to make sure that this thing goes through. And with that, my final question is, this came from several people, so obviously it's of interest. If somebody has a piece of property or is aware of a piece of property that they may want to sell or donate, who do they contact?
Well, I guess, Nate, I'm going to let you answer that if you can. If not, then I'll give it a shot.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, they can certainly reach out directly to us, and maybe we can work with Bob to put some contact information on the Facebook page.
All right. So also, if an individual has an interest in doing that, if you're a SAM member, you know how to get a hold of us. You can reach us in Augusta. We can also, we have a terrific relationship with the department, the governor's office. So if someone has an interest in doing this, they can contact the Sportsman's Alliance of Maine and Augusta at 623-4589, or go online and you can Facebook message us. Just call us right at the office and we can make that happen. With that, I guess, is there anything else that you'd like to say, Jerry? No. Okay. All right. I really want to thank Nate. You've been terrific, Nate Webb. You've been terrifically patient with me. I can be high anxiety sometimes. I call folks when I get really excited about something. I really want to thank the department for the information that you've provided to us. I know that you can't take a political position on this until you're asked to, and the legislature's weighed in on it. But I really have asked you to do a lot. And I wanted to thank you and your staff for the work that you've done on this legislation and helping us get to where we are. With that, I'm gonna wrap it up for me. Nate, is there anything that you from the department would like to say?
No, I'd just like to thank you, David, as well. And thank you for the vote of confidence a few minutes ago. We certainly appreciate that. And I think above all, I just wanted to say we really appreciate the passion that you and all the listeners have for deer in Maine and wildlife management in Maine. And we may not always agree on everything, but that's part of what makes our work interesting. And we all have the same ultimate goals in mind, and that's what's important. So thank you for having us, and we look forward to doing this again.
So Jerry, did you want to, I don't really know what you meant by that. Jerry's always getting a good joke in at the end. For you folks that are out there, hope you'll consider joining the Sportsman's Alliance of Maine. The reason that we make change in Augusta is because we have terrific members, and you can join the Sportsman's Alliance at sportsmansallianceofmaine.org. You can call our office at 623-4589 and keep up to date on what's going on this issue and others. Thank you for attending, and you can continue to message us on our Facebook page, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. Thank you, Bob, for everything that you've done to help us with this effort, and I hope that we're successful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this will be the start of bigger and better things.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
We're out.